The land stretched wide and golden beneath the late summer sun, a quilt of tall grasses and furrowed fields that fed not only the woman who owned it, but much of the valley beyond. To anyone who passed her homestead from the road, she appeared to be blessed beyond measure. Her house was large, built of solid timber and whitewashed stone. Her barns were filled with hay, her cattle fat and healthy. She had inherited this wealth from her late husband, a rancher whose industrious hands had carved prosperity from wilderness, but though she lived amidst abundance, the woman's heart was barren. She had no child. When her husband was alive, whispers among the townsfolk had been easy enough to ignore. They pitied her for her empty cradle, but his presence shielded her from the worst of their gossip. After his death, however, her solitude became sharper, more exposed. Neighbors who once praised her generosity now muttered about her lineage ending in silence, her wealth without an heir. Even her kin-distant cousins who visited with too bright smiles made little secret of their desire to inherit her land should she die without a son or daughter. In church pews, she felt eyes upon her, lingering not on her face but on the space beside her where a child might have sat. At market, women her age came surrounded by clusters of little ones tugging at their skirts, while she walked alone, her hands clutching only her basket. Some offered polite condolences, but their eyes gleamed with judgment. A woman without children was a tree that never bore fruit, they seemed to say. The truth gnawed at her, and though she masked it well, the silence in her house grew unbearable. Each night she dined at a table meant for 6, her husband's chair still in place though empty, her gaze falling too often on the corner where a cradle had once stood. Now gathering dust. She was not without suitors, men who sought her land more than her company. Some were bold, offering marriage as though it were a business deal. She would gain protection, they would gain her inheritance. Others came slyly, couching their intentions in compliments, praising her strength, her cooking, her management of cattle. But she could see through them all. What they wanted was not her companionship, but her fields, her water rights, her fertile acres, and so she hardened her heart against them. Yet for all her wealth, she could not escape the quiet despair that came with the knowledge that her bloodline would vanish with her. At night, when the prairie wind rattled the shutters, she prayed not for riches, nor for safety, but for a child, a son to bear her husband's name, a daughter to soften her days, someone to inherit not only her land but her love. She prayed until the words fell dry in her throat, and still the cradle remained empty. Her loneliness took on a strange shape. It was not simply the absence of a child, but the absence of legacy. She feared the land itself would forget her when she was gone. Fields remembered their tillers, rivers remembered the ones who dug their wells, but when there was no heir to walk the same ground, memories faded like tracks in dust. Each season seemed to underline her loss. In spring, she watched calves stumble beside their mothers, their small legs trembling with new life. In summer, she listened to children laughing in the irrigation canals, splashing as they cooled themselves from the heat. In autumn, she saw families gathering harvest together, hands working in rhythm, laughter rising over the fields. Winter brought silence, but not her kind of silence. It was the silence of families huddled by firesides, stories whispered to children under thick quilts. Her silence was lonelier. Sometimes she caught herself speaking aloud when no one was there, as though an unseen listener might answer. Other times, she dreamed of footsteps in the hall or a child's laughter outside her window, only to wake to the hollowness of her home. And yet, despite the ache, she endured. She worked the land herself, oversaw her ranch hands with a keen eye, and paid her debts promptly. Outwardly, she remained a woman of respect and substance. Inwardly, her longing festered like an unhealed wound. It was into this solitude, into this unspoken hunger, That the stranger would one day come, the man whose presence would shift the balance of her world, and to whom she would whisper the desperate bargain that would forever bind her fate to his. The evening he came. The sky was burning down into twilight, the horizon stained in colors of ember and ash. The woman had just finished locking her barn when she saw him half shadow, half man stumbling along the ridge above her fields. For a moment, she thought him a mirage, the heat of the long day still tricking her eyes. But as he drew closer, the limp in his stride became clear, as did the blood darkening his shirt near the shoulder. She froze. The stories of raiding parties were never far from people's lips, and though fewer in recent years, fear of the Apache still lingered in the valley like a smoke that never lifted. He carried no rifle, no bow, but she knew enough to recognize the lean figure, the black braids, the set of his features. Her first instinct was to retreat inside, bar the door, and send her ranch hands to deal with him. But something in the man's movements stayed her. He did not move with aggression or threat. He staggered, half exhausted, as if each step cost him dearly. By the time he reached her gate, his breath rasped in his chest, and his eyes, dark, sharp, unyielding, met hers, only briefly before they lowered. He did not speak. He did not beg. He simply stood there, swaying, blood seeping through the cloth he had tied clumsily around his wound. The woman's heart thundered. She knew the risk in helping him. If word spread that she had sheltered an Apache, it would be another mark against her, another reason for neighbors to whisper about her judgment, perhaps even to turn on her. Yet beneath her fear, another thought rose, strange and undeniable. Here was someone lonelier than she, a figure apart, cut off from his people as she was from hers. Without a word, she opened the gate. Inside the house, the air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and sage. She guided him to a chair by the hearth and fetched water to wash the wound. He did not resist her touch, though his body tensed as though every nerve braced for pain. The bullet had passed clean through his shoulder luck, or perhaps something more. She worked in silence, her hands steady, though inside she trembled. When she had finished binding him, she waited for him to speak. But he said nothing. It was only later, when she placed a plate of bread and beans before him, that his voice broke the silence. His words came haltingly, his English accented but clear. He told her only that he had been traveling for many days, separated from his kin. He did not say how, nor why. His eyes, when they met hers, gave away nothing, no plea, no promise, no explanation. That night he slept by the fire, and she lay awake in her bed, listening to the strange presence breathing in her house. It unsettled her, yet it also stirred something long dormant, a sense of being seen, of not being alone in the vast silence that had weighed on her for years. In the days that followed, he did not leave. His wound healed slowly, and though he offered no gratitude in words, he began to work around the homestead. He fetched water, chopped wood, mended tools. He moved with quiet efficiency, never asking permission, never waiting for instruction. Ranch hands watched him warily, but he never raised his voice or hand to them. They called him the Apache and avoided his gaze. The woman noticed, however, that the chores were lighter with him there, the days more ordered. His silence, which at first had seemed foreign, became something she grew to understand like the silence of the land itself, carrying meaning without words. At dusk, she sometimes found him standing at the edge of her property, staring toward the mountains. His expression then was unreadable, his posture taut with longing. It was as though part of him remained elsewhere, tied to a world she could never enter, and yet, despite that distance, he was there, under her roof, breathing the same air, sharing the same table. The woman began to sense the weight of possibility in his presence, though she could not yet name it. She only knew that when her eyes lingered on him, the thought of her empty cradle, seemed sharper, more unbearable, and the shape of a dangerous, unspoken bargain began to take root in her mind. The thought had been growing inside her like a thorn hidden under the skin small at first, irritating, then impossible to ignore. By the time the Apache's wound had healed enough that he could take up more work around her land, she could no longer quiet the whisper that returned each night when she stared at the cradle in the corner of her room. She had tried to banish it, tried to tell herself she was a fool, that such an idea was madness. And yet, each morning when she saw him, shoulders glistening with sweat as he carried water from the well or bent low to mend a fence post, her heart beat with a dangerous rhythm. Here was a man strong enough to shape life, to sow seed into earth, and bring forth growth. If he could bring her a child, then perhaps her long hunger might finally end. But how could she ask it? For weeks, the question pressed against her throat like a secret she could not swallow. She told herself it would be wrong, that the gulf between them, of blood, of language, of belonging, was too great. And yet the nights were long, and her loneliness pressed heavy upon her chest. She could not look at him without imagining the son who might come of such a union, a child with dark eyes and strong hands, one who could inherit the land, walk its fields, and keep her memory alive long after she was gone. One evening, when the cicadas sang loud in the cottonwoods and the last light melted into the hills, she found him seated near the barn sharpening a knife. The rasp of stone on metal filled the air, steady and deliberate. She stood a long while watching him before she forced herself forward. He looked up as her shadow fell across him. His gaze was steady, patient, waiting. Her mouth went dry. She almost turned back, but then the words tumbled from her lips, broken and soft. "I will give you my land if you give me a son." The words hung between them, fragile and sharp, heavier than any prayer she had ever spoken. For a heartbeat, she thought he had not understood. His face remained unreadable, as if carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. Then he set the knife aside. His eyes fixed on hers, unblinking, and in them she saw not surprise but something older, weariness, perhaps, or sorrow that had no name. "Land?" he said at last, his voice low, accented, each syllable deliberate. "Yes." Her voice trembled, but she steadied it. "All of it. Every acre. I have no one to inherit it. If I have a son, your son, he will be mine. But the land will be yours when I die." The silence stretched long. The cicadas droned on. Her heart pounded as though she had opened a door that could never again be closed. At last he spoke. "You think a son can be traded, like cattle, like corn." His words cut her, but she did not look away. "I think a son is the only thing I have ever wanted," she whispered, "and the only thing I cannot make alone." His gaze softened then, though only by a fraction. He looked away, toward the mountains, as though searching their peaks for an answer. When he spoke again, his voice carried something weightier, something that felt like prayer. "A son is not yours to take. He belongs to the earth, to the wind, to the blood that carries him." Her throat tightened. "Then let the earth and the wind and the blood decide, but let me try." He studied her a long while more. The night deepened, shadows lengthened, and the stars began to prick the sky. Finally, he inclined his head, the smallest of nods. Not agreement, not surrender, but acknowledgment. And in that moment, she knew the bargain had been struck. The days after the bargain carried a stillness, like the breathless pause before storm. She moved through her routines as though nothing had changed, feeding chickens, overseeing her hands, tending to the accounts, but every glance at him felt weighted. Every silence between them filled with the unspoken. The Apache man, for his part, said little. He did not press her further, nor remind her of the words she had whispered, yet she sensed the shift in him too. He lingered longer near the house now, his presence less fleeting, as if he were waiting for something inevitable to unfold. first night came without ceremony. No courtship, no gentle weaving of affection, only necessity. She found him by the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames, and without speaking she reached for him. Her hands trembled, not with fear but with the weight of her choice. He did not resist, nor did he approach her with hunger. He only allowed, steady and quiet, as though honoring a promise. Their joining was awkward, unpracticed. There was no romance in it, no tender words. Yet beneath the strangeness there lay something solemn, almost sacred. It was as if the land itself bore witness, the old timbers of the house creaking, the wind rattling the shutters, the earth humming beneath the floorboards. In the days that followed, she wondered at the absence of shame. She had expected guilt, perhaps even disgust, but instead she felt something closer to resolve. The bargain was not born of love, yet it was not without dignity. It was a pact carved from loneliness and longing, from the need for legacy. Still, she found herself studying him with new eyes. When he worked the fields, his body bending and lifting with unyielding rhythm, she thought of the strength he carried in his blood, the same strength she now prayed would carry into her child. When he sat in silence at the table, she wondered, what thoughts shaped the darkness in his gaze? Was he remembering his people? Did he see her as captor or companion? One evening, after their union had become more frequent, she dared to ask, "Why did you agree?" He looked at her a long time before answering. "A man without a people is already half dead," he said. "If I give you a son, then perhaps part of me lives, even when I am gone." The words struck her like a stone, dropped into still water. She had thought of him only as a vessel for her need, but now she understood that he too bore a hunger different from hers, but no less consuming. She wanted an heir. He wanted continuity, a tether to a world from which he had been cut adrift. That night, their intimacy felt different. Still not tender, not the gentle weaving of lovers, but closer to reverence. She touched him with less desperation and more acknowledgement. He met her not with passion, but with the gravity of a man fulfilling something larger than himself. As the weeks stretched into months, the rhythm of their lives took on a strange balance. The neighbors continued to whisper, for though he never spoke to them, they could not ignore the presence of the Apache living beneath her roof. Some muttered that she had gone mad, others that she had been bewitched. But she ignored them, as she had learned to ignore so many judgments. Inside her walls, she felt something stir, not yet a child, but the possibility of one. And though she knew affection might never bloom between them as it did in storybooks, she also knew their pact had grown roots deeper than either of them had expected. There were nights when she woke to find him already awake, staring at the ceiling, as though listening to a language only he could hear. And sometimes, in those moments, she felt the smallest flicker of something dangerous. Not love, but the beginning of respect. Perhaps even kinship. The cradle in the corner of her room remained empty, yet for the first time in years, she began to believe it might not stay that way forever. The first changes were subtle, so quiet the woman almost mistook them for coincidence. The rains that spring came early, soft showers that lingered over her fields, soaking the earth until the soil was dark and fragrant. Seedlings sprouted stronger than she had ever seen, their green shoots piercing the ground with vigor. By midsummer, the wheat stood tall, each stalk heavy with promise. Neighbors noticed. Strange? One remarked at the market, his tone sly. "Your land's always been good, but this year it looks as though the Lord himself walks your fields." She smiled, said nothing. She knew their eyes drifted toward her house, where the Apache man still labored. His presence clung to her land like a shadow. They whispered that he had brought some hidden power, some wild spirit that bent the earth to his will. Others warned that the bounty was unnatural, that blessings from such blood came at a cost. Woman herself could not explain it. But she felt the shift too. The cattle fattened on less feed, the orchard bore fruit sweeter than any in years past, and the river that edged her property seemed fuller, its waters running clear even in dry weeks. It was as if the land itself breathed easier beneath his. Tread out, she began to watch him more closely. At dusk, he often stood at the edges of her fields, still as stone, his eyes scanning the horizon. Once, she caught him murmuring words in his own tongue, low and melodic, the syllables carrying like wind through grass. He touched the earth with his palm, then pressed the soil to his chest as though greeting an old friend. When she asked what he had spoken, he only shook his head. Words for the land, not for you. His refusal did not wound her. It only deepened her curiosity. She began to sense that his silence was not emptiness but fullness, an understanding of the earth that ran deeper than her own. She had always seen the land as inheritance, as wealth. He seemed to see it as kindled out by autumn. The valley could not deny her fortune. While other farms struggled with blight or thin harvests, her granaries overflowed. Her workers, once skeptical, began to glance at the Apache with something like respect, even if they kept their distance. Yet the whispers among her neighbors grew darker. Some said she had bargained with heathen spirits. Others claimed she had given herself to the Apache in exchange for unnatural favor. The woman heard their words but did not answer them. She knew. The truth of her bargain was stranger still. Not spirits, but flesh and blood, a pact whispered in desperation. And yet, perhaps the land had listened too. Her own body began to change. A heaviness settled in her belly, a quiet ache in her bones. She told no one at first, not even him, but each morning she woke with the certainty that something had taken root inside her. The cradle no longer seemed like an empty relic. It seemed like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. One evening, as the first frost silvered the fields, she found him again at the edge of the property, his hand pressed to the soil. She approached, the cold air biting her cheeks, and asked softly, "What do you hear when you listen like that?" He turned his gaze toward her, unreadable as ever. "The land speaks," he said simply. "It remembers. It waits. For what?" "For the ones who belong to it." His words lingered in her chest long after he walked away. She wondered then whether she herself belonged, or whether she was only borrowing what had never been hers. But when she laid her hand across her belly later, that night, feeling the faintest swell of new life, she whispered a prayer of her own, that the child would belong to her, to him, and to the land that now seemed to breathe beneath them both. Winter came with a sharpness that year, winds cutting down from the mountains, snow gathering in drifts against the homestead walls. The woman moved slower now, her belly heavy with the weight of promise. Each step reminded her of the bargain struck, each flutter in her womb a reminder that she was no longer alone. Her neighbors watched with sharp eyes. At market, women whispered behind their shawls, and men spoke in tones too loud to be called discreet. "She carries his child," they said, spitting the word Apache as if it were poison. Some pitied her, others sneered, but all agreed this land would one day pass to a boy with dark eyes and mixed blood. The woman did not answer them. She returned home each time with her chin high, her hand steady on her horse's reins. Inside her walls, she closed herself off from their voices and instead turned inward to the life moving inside her, to the warmth of the fire, to the silent presence of the man who had become both stranger and necessity. The months blurred together. He worked tirelessly, splitting wood, mending barns, bringing in feed. Though he never spoke of the child, she noticed the way his eyes lingered on her stomach, the faint shift in his expression when the baby kicked beneath her ribs. Once, as she winced from a sharp pain, his hand moved instinctively as if to steady her, then stopped short, hovering inches from her body before falling away. When the time finally came, It was deep in the night, snow thick on the ground, the wind howling like wolves outside. The first pain struck like knives twisting through her. She sent the ranch hands running for the midwife, but by the time the woman arrived, breathless and bundled against the cold, sweat was already pouring down her face, and the contractions came fast. The birth was long and brutal. Hours passed. In a haze of fire and agony, her cries muffled against the quilts. The midwife whispered prayers, urging her to breathe, to push, to endure. At the edge of the room, the Apache stood silent, a shadow against the wall. He did not move forward, did not interfere, but his gaze never left her. And then, just as dawn broke over the horizon, a new cry split the air. Thin at first, then rising, strong and clear. The midwife lifted the child, slick with blood and newness, and placed him against his mother's chest. A boy. The woman wept as she had not wept since her husband's death. She cradled the infant, his tiny fingers curling against her skin, his dark eyes opening briefly to meet hers. In them, she saw both the Apache spirit and her own desperate longing made flesh. When she finally looked up, she saw the man still watching, his expression unreadable. For a long time he said nothing, until at last he murmured words in his tongue low, reverent, almost like a blessing. The neighbors came days later under the guise of offering food and congratulations, but their eyes betrayed them. They leaned too close, peering at the boy, whispering about his dark skin, his black hair. Their envy was sharp, for the woman had an air now something their gossip could never strip from her. Yet their envy curdled quickly into suspicion. Some muttered that her land would now belong to an Apache's blood, that the valley itself was cursed. She paid them no mind. She rocked her son in the cradle that had gathered dust for so long, her heart swelling each time his cries filled the house. The silence that had haunted her was broken, and yet, late at night, when the child slept and the fire burned low, she sometimes glanced at the man across the room and felt unease stir in her chest. The boy bore his mark as surely as he bore hers. He was a bridge between two worlds that despised each other. Love filled her arms, but the bargain was not yet done. The boy grew quickly, as if the earth itself had lent him its strength. By his first spring he was already walking, his laughter ringing across the homestead like chimes in the wind. The woman carried him everywhere, pride shining from her like sunlight. For the first time in her life she felt complete, but completion breeds envy, and envy soon turns to malice. The neighbors' whispers sharpened as the seasons turned. Where once they muttered in private, now their words spilled openly. That land will pass to an Apache's son, they spat. What right does she have to give fertile acres to heathen blood? Some claimed her prosperity came from unholy dealings, others that she had bewitched the Apache into serving her. Men who had once courted her returned now with threats, reminding her that women without strong protection often found their property contested. The woman bore their venom with defiance, but inside, fear gnawed at her. She had thought her bargain clever, a way to secure both son and heir, but she had underestimated how deeply suspicion ran in men's hearts. The breaking point came one dry autumn when the valley's crops faltered. Blight took the corn, drought withered the beans, but her fields rich, green, abundant stood untouched. Desperation twisted into anger, and her neighbors' envy boiled over. They gathered at her gates one evening, voices raised, demanding answers. "You've cursed the valley with that child," one man shouted, pointing at the boy who clung to his mother's skirts. "Your land thrives while ours rots. You've wrought heathen magic upon us all." The woman's hands shook, but before she could reply, the Apache stepped forward. For months he had remained silent in the face of their hostility, but now his voice rang out, low and steady. "This land was never yours," he said. The words cut through the crowd like a blade. Murmurs rippled. Some spat, others laughed, but all bristled at the audacity of his claim. "What do you mean?" The woman asked, her heart pounding. He turned to her then, and in his gaze she saw the truth unraveling. "These fields, these rivers, these hills, they belonged to my people before your kind ever built fences. Your bargain was not yours to offer. You gave me what was already mine." The weight of his words pressed on her chest until she could scarcely breathe. She thought back to the nights she had seen him kneel at the soil, whispering in his tongue. He had not been tending her land. He had been speaking to his own. The crowd erupted, their anger fanned by his defiance. Shouts turned to threats, fists raised. Some called for the sheriff, others for fire to burn him out. The woman clutched her son close, fear twisting her stomach. In the chaos, the Apache raised his hand, his voice carrying above the din. "You may drive me out, you may curse my name, but the boy is mine as much as hers. His blood ties him to this earth, to the people you tried to erase. He will not forget." The woman's heart fractured. She had wanted an heir, a son to carry her name and her land. But now she understood the truth. The child belonged to both of them, to two worlds locked in hatred, to a land that refused to be owned. The crowd dispersed only when the sheriff arrived, promising to settle the matter peacefully. But peace was a thin veil. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Men spoke of legal challenges, of forcing her from her home. Women warned their children not to play near her gates. That night, the woman sat by the fire with her son in her arms, staring across the room at the Apache. His face was shadowed, unreadable. The boy stirred in his sleep, his small hand curling around her finger, his breath warm against her chest. The bargain had given her a child, but it had also unraveled every certainty she once held. The land was not hers alone. The boy was not hers alone. And the price of her desperation was only now beginning to reveal itself. The nights grew quieter after the confrontation, but it was not the peace of resolution. It was the brittle silence of things left unsaid, of truths too heavy to be carried openly. The neighbors kept their distance, though she could feel their eyes upon her homestead like arrows drawn taut. The sheriff's promises of keeping order offered little comfort. She knew in her bones that the valley was waiting, watching, for her to falter. And yet, inside her home, life pulsed strong. Her son's laughter filled every corner, chasing away the silence that had once haunted her halls. He toddled after chickens, splashed in puddles after rain, reached for the horses with tiny, fearless hands. When he smiled, it was as if the land itself exhaled. The Apache watched him with a gaze that was neither soft nor distant, but steady, as though memorizing every movement. Sometimes, when the boy slept, the man would sit close to the cradle and murmur in his tongue low words like lullabies, words the woman could not understand but which carried weight, like stories older than the timber beams above them. It was during one such night, when the fire burned low and the boy dreamed fitfully, that the man finally spoke to her. "He carries two rivers in his blood," he said, his eyes fixed on the child. "One from you, one from me. If he tries to follow only one, he will drown. He must learn to walk between them." The woman listened, her heart tightening. She wanted to protest, to claim the boy wholly as hers, to insist that he was the answer to her prayers and her legacy alone. But the truth pressed hard against her chest. She could not deny the darkness of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his small hands grasped the soil as though he already understood its weight. "Will you stay?" she asked at last. He shook his head slowly. "This is not my place. The land remembers me, but the people here never will. If I stay, they will come for me again and for him." His gaze softened then, just barely. "But I leave part of myself with you. Raise him to honor both sides. Do not let him forget." Her throat burned, but she nodded. She had made a bargain. She had received her son. She could not bind the man what he had already given. At dawn, he was gone. No farewell, no explanation, only the faint print of his boots in the dust, leading toward the mountains. She stood at the threshold with her son in her arms, watching the horizon until the wind erased all trace of him. Seasons passed. The boy grew, his laughter turning to questions, his steps quickening into runs across the fields. The neighbors still whispered, still cast wary glances, but they could not deny what was plain. The land flourished under him. Crops rose strong, rivers stayed full, the orchards bent heavy with fruit. Children of other farms, despite their parents. Warnings drifted toward him, drawn by his brightness. The woman aged, her hair silvering, her body slowing. Yet each time she saw her son walking the fields, barefoot, head high, speaking to the wind as though it were an old friend, she felt a fierce pride. He was hers and not hers. He was the living thread between two worlds that had tried to remain apart. When he laughed, the land seemed to laugh with him. When he cried, the earth drank his tears. And when he stood still, silent and listening at the edge of the fields, she knew he was hearing the same voices his father had once heard. Whispers of a land that remembered. Her bargain had begun as desperation, a whispered plea in the shadow of loneliness. It had cost her comfort, safety, the illusion of belonging. But it had given her something greater, a son who carried more than her name, a child whose blood tied him not only to her land but to the spirit that lived beneath it. And so, though the valley might never accept him, she knew the earth already had. The legacy was not the land she had promised away, but the boy himself living, breathing, straddling two worlds, destined to outlast them both.